In the darkness of night, two families watched the same fire. As flames painted the Arkansas sky orange over Elaine, Thomas Carter and his family ran west. Elijah Brooks and his family ran east. Neither looked back. Because looking back meant witnessing the end of those who stayed. It was October 1919, the bloody climax of what would be known as America's Red Summer. Over one brutal season, 38 separate racial pogroms erupted across the nation. Hundreds of Black Americans were murdered. Thousands more were forced to abandon their homes, their land, their past. Thomas and Elijah didn't know each other. But that night, they lived the same terror. Made the same decision. North. At any cost, north. 46 years later, in 1965 Harlem, their grandchildren would unite in a wedding ceremony. But this wasn't just a love story. This was the story of how trauma echoes through generations, and how fate works even in the darkest nights. If this forgotten history moves you, subscribe to our channel and continue discovering the real face of the Great Migration. Share it so the forgotten can be remembered and new generations can know. On that October night in 1919, a sharecroppers' union meeting was taking place in Elaine. Black farmers were trying to organize against the white landowner system of debt peonage. But white society saw it as insurrection. And the response was savage. At midnight, armed white mobs stormed the town. Houses were set ablaze. Families were driven from the roads. Official records claim between 100 and 200 Black Americans were killed. But the real number was never known. Because bodies were thrown into rivers. Graves were hidden. And nobody counted. Thomas Carter was 28 that night. With his wife Clara and 4-year-old son Daniel, he'd taken shelter in their cotton field shack. But the shack wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. When Thomas looked through the window and saw his neighbor's house engulfed in flames, he didn't know who was inside. But he heard the screams. And those screams told him what he had to do. Run. Run now. Thomas grabbed Clara's hand. Clara lifted Daniel onto her back. And in the darkness, they ran through the fields toward the edge of town. Their feet were bare. Daniel was crying, but Clara silenced him. Because sound meant death. They ran for miles. By dawn, they hid under a railroad car. All day, they stayed silent. When night came, they ran again. For 3 days, they fled like this. No food. No water. Just the instinct to survive. On the other side of town that same night, Elijah Brooks was also running. With his wife May and 6-year-old daughter Grace, they'd taken refuge in the woods. Elijah had attended the meeting. He was a union member. But now that membership was a death sentence. White mobs had compiled a list of everyone at the meeting. And Elijah's name was on it. May had wrapped Grace in a blanket. But the child was trembling. Not from cold. From fear. "Daddy, where are we going?" she whispered. Elijah didn't answer. Because he didn't know. All he knew was they could never go back. When the Carter family reached Chicago, it was December 1919. After 3 months of travel, they arrived in South Side penniless, hungry, and exhausted. Chicago was the epicenter of the Great Migration in those days. The factories were hiring. Stockyards, railroads, steel mills. There were jobs for Black migrants. But there was no life. Thomas got work in a slaughterhouse. 12 hours a day, butchering animal carcasses. The pay was low, but it was safer than Elaine. Or so he thought. Because in July 1919, Chicago had experienced its own racial pogrom. Red Summer wasn't just the South. It was the North too. Clara moved into a small apartment shared with 6 other families. It had 2 rooms but housed 19 people. Night shift workers slept during the day. Day shift workers slept at night. Bed sharing was part of survival. As Daniel grew up, he accepted this life as normal. Because he knew no other life. He didn't remember Elaine. He only knew that sometimes his mother woke screaming from nightmares. The Brooks family arrived in New York. Harlem. In January 1920, on icy streets, they moved into a basement apartment. Elijah worked construction. He dug foundations for skyscrapers. It was dangerous, exhausting, low-paying work. But he was alive. And that was enough. May cleaned houses. She worked 10-hour days in the Manhattan apartments of white families. She left Grace with a neighbor. And every evening when she came home, she held her daughter and said, "We're safe now." But fear still lived in May's eyes. Through the 1920s, the two families lived unaware of each other. In Chicago, Thomas Carter rose to foreman at the slaughterhouse. His pay increased. They rented a small house. Daniel started school. But at home, Elaine was never mentioned. Clara tried to forget that night. But she couldn't. Every flickering light reminded her of that fire. Every unexpected sound brought back those screams. In New York, Elijah Brooks began working as a waiter in Harlem's jazz clubs. The Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom. These were the brilliant years of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker. Black artists were making history. But Elijah still saw darkness beneath the glamour. Because Harlem wasn't just jazz and poetry. It was also a ghetto. Also poverty. Also racism. Just less visible. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, both families were deeply affected. Thomas Carter lost his job. The slaughterhouse closed. He was unemployed for months. Eventually he found work with WPA programs, building streets. Daniel, at 15, wanted to quit school to help his father. But Thomas refused. "You're going to school," he said. "I didn't flee Elaine so you could quit school." Elijah Brooks also lost his job. Construction stopped. Waiter work dried up. May volunteered at soup kitchens distributing meals. Grace, at 17, started working at a grocery store. But she didn't quit school. Because May constantly told her daughter, "Education is the one thing nobody can take from you." When World War II began in the 1940s, Daniel Carter and Grace Brooks, in different cities, faced the same reality. Daniel enlisted in the U.S. Army. But in a segregated black unit. Because even the military was segregated. He fought Nazis in Europe. But wasn't considered an equal citizen in his own country. Grace worked in defense manufacturing. She assembled aircraft parts. But earned less than white men. Because she was black and a woman. After the war, Daniel returned to Chicago. He married. Had a daughter. They named her Lorraine. Clara became a grandmother and never told her granddaughter about Elaine. Because some things shouldn't be passed down through generations. Or so she thought. But trauma transmits even when unspoken. Growing up, Lorraine never understood why her grandmother sometimes woke trembling. But that trembling passed to her too. In New York, Grace married. Had a son. They named him Marcus. May became a grandmother and told Marcus about Harlem's history. She read him Langston Hughes poetry. Played Duke Ellington music. But she didn't speak of Elaine. Because some wounds can't be opened with words. In the 1950s, Lorraine Carter grew up in Chicago. Segregation still existed, but thanks to the education her father Daniel gave her, she went to college. She studied sociology. Joined the civil rights movement. When the Montgomery bus boycott happened in 1955, she organized Chicago support. When the Greensboro sit-ins began in 1960, she led similar actions in Chicago. Lorraine wanted change. But she didn't yet know what change would cost. In Harlem, Marcus Brooks studied literature. At Columbia University, he examined James Baldwin's works. Reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, he understood his own family's invisibility. He wondered why his grandmother May never spoke of the South. But he didn't ask. Because some questions shouldn't be asked. In 1963, the March on Washington took place. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Lorraine Carter took a bus from Chicago to Washington. Marcus Brooks took a train from Harlem. Both stood in that same plaza, among hundreds of thousands. But they hadn't met yet. Because fate wasn't ready. In the summer of 1964, 3 civil rights activists were murdered in Mississippi. Freedom's summer had begun with hope but ended in blood. Lorraine organized a memorial in Chicago. Marcus joined a protest march in Harlem. Both felt the same rage, the same despair. But their paths still hadn't crossed. In February 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated in Harlem. Marcus was at the funeral. Through tears, he embraced his grandmother. May whispered in her grandson's ear, "You live. You see the change we couldn't see." In March 1965, the march from Selma to Montgomery took place. On what became known as Bloody Sunday, police attacked black protesters. Television footage shook the entire nation. Lorraine organized a solidarity event in Chicago. A group of activists from New York came to Chicago to participate. And one person in that group was Marcus Brooks. For the first time, in a church meeting room, Lorraine and Marcus met. Lorraine was speaking at the microphone, explaining the importance of the Voting Rights Act. Marcus sat in the back row listening. And he felt something. Not love, not yet. But a connection. A familiarity. As if he'd seen this woman before. But he hadn't. After the meeting, Marcus approached her. "Good speech," he said. Lorraine smiled. "Thanks. You're from New York." Marcus nodded. "Harlem. You. Chicago. But my family's from Arkansas." Marcus froze. "Mine too." "Where from?" "Elaine," Lorraine said. And Marcus's face changed. "I'm from Elaine too. My family. They fled in 1919. 2 people froze in that moment. Because Elaine wasn't just a town name. Elaine was a trauma. A massacre. A history people tried to forget. And now, in 1965 Chicago, 2 strangers discovered they shared the same past. "My grandmother never talked about it," Marcus said. "Mine either," Lorraine said. "She just said, we fled. Nothing else." That night in a cafe, they talked for hours. Not about Elaine. Because it was a story they didn't know. But about the future. About civil rights. About change. About hope. And as they talked, something built. Trust. Understanding. Maybe love. 6 months later, in August 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed. It was a historic victory. But that same month, the Watts riots erupted in Los Angeles. Hope and rage intertwined. Lorraine and Marcus lived through these complex times together. They traveled back and forth between Chicago and Harlem. And gradually, they introduced their families. Daniel Carter and Grace Brooks met for the first time at a Sunday lunch. At Lorraine's home in Chicago. When Daniel opened the door and saw Grace, he hesitated for a moment. Because there was something in Grace's face. A recognition. Grace felt it too. "Have we met before?" Daniel asked. "I don't think so," Grace said. But neither felt comfortable. Throughout lunch, the conversation was awkward. Until Thomas Carter's name came up. Lorraine said, "My grandfather was Thomas." Grace froze. "My father was Elijah. Elijah Brooks." Daniel raised his head. "Brooks? From Elaine." Grace slowly nodded. "Yes. 1919. Silence fell. Forks stopped clinking. Everyone understood. Because everyone who fled Elaine knew the same night. The same fire. The same horror. "Your family was there that night," Daniel said, his voice changing. "Yours too," Grace said, eyes filling. And in that moment, 2 generations understood each other's pain. Thomas and Elijah had fled from the same darkness. Clara and May had lived the same fear. Daniel and Grace had grown up in the same silence. And now, Lorraine and Marcus would meet in the same future. In December 1965, Marcus proposed to Lorraine. On the Brooklyn Bridge, as snow fell, he knelt. "Fate brought us together," he said. "Fate crossed the paths of two families. Maybe our grandfathers saw each other that night as they fled. Maybe they never did. But we're here. And that's a sign." Lorraine cried. And she said yes. The wedding took place in June 1966, in Harlem, at Abyssinian Baptist Church. Hundreds of guests attended. But the most important guests sat in the front row. Clara Carter and May Brooks. Two grandmothers. Two survivors. Two women who had witnessed the same fire in 1919 but never met. Now, at their grandchildren's wedding, they sat side by side. When the ceremony began, the minister said, "This isn't just a marriage. This is two families uniting. Two histories meeting. And trauma being transformed by love." Clara and May held each other's hands. Tears flowed. But this time, the tears weren't fear. Weren't sorrow. They were victory. Because in 1919, they had fled. But in 1966, their grandchildren were marrying. The flight hadn't been loss. It was survival. And survival was winning. At the wedding reception, Daniel and Grace danced. Both were old now. Both were tired. But as they danced, they remembered those children from 1919. Daniel, the 4-year-old running through cotton fields. Grace, the 6-year-old trembling in a blanket. Now, in their 70s, dancing at a wedding. And this was proof that miracles exist. As the night went on, Clara and May talked. For the first time, they spoke of Elaine. The fire. The screams. The flight. And as they spoke, a weight lifted. Because trauma lightens when shared. Silence is poison. But words are the antidote. "We survived," Clara said. "Yes," May said. "And now they're married. Our flight wasn't in vain." The Great Migration is the story of 6 million people. But every story is a choice. Thomas and Elijah chose to flee. Clara and May chose to survive. Daniel and Grace chose silence. Lorraine and Marcus chose to speak. And every choice shaped the next generation. The Elaine massacre is one of the darkest moments in American history. But even in darkness, there is light. Thomas and Elijah's flight wasn't defeat. It was an act of resistance. And the fruit of that resistance was harvested 46 years later at a wedding in Harlem. Lorraine and Marcus had 3 children. And they told each child the story of Elaine. Because forgetting isn't betrayal, but remembering is honor. And this family would no longer forget. In 1969, Clara Carter died. Her last words, "Thomas was right. We fled. But we didn't lose." In 1971, May Brooks died. Her last words, "Elijah was right. We ran. But we survived." And in 2019, on the 100th anniversary of the Elaine massacre, Lorraine and Marcus's grandchildren went to Arkansas. To Elaine. Now there was a memorial. The names of those killed were engraved. And among those names were the neighbors of Thomas Carter and Elijah Brooks. They had survived. But hundreds had not. The grandchildren stood before the memorial. They shed tears. But they also smiled. Because they were alive. They came from the blood of 2 families who fled Elaine. And this wasn't just survival. This was triumph.